Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Shmuley, I cannot tell you how much good it does my heart to be at this table at this moment. I mean, I've been to dinners, Shabtai dinners that you've hosted many times before, and they're always wonderful and warm and filled with the spirit of life and everything that Yale at its best stands for and exemplifies. But this night is special. The last 5 days have been, for me, absolutely dreadful. As a Jew, as a staunch, forever friend of Israel, and as a friend, as I'd like to think, of civilization and the values of civilized life. It's just been awful. I suspect that's been true for many of you around the table as well. And the warmth of your companionship this evening and the table that you have set to make it possible for me is medicine for my heart, truly. So I thank you for that, and I thank all of you just for your presence here tonight. It's for me, it's a mitzvah. It means the world to me, and it's the solace I really badly needed and was looking forward to all day long. Okay, so I'm going to answer the question that Ryan asked, but I'm going to work my way around to it by slow degrees. Perhaps you'll think too slow. If I go on too long, just, I don't know, throw something at me or turn out the lights. In 2016, I published a book called Confessions of a Born-Again Pagan, which is a very large book. I'd like to say that its size and weight is excused by the breadth of subjects I cover and the number of thinkers I review, but honestly, none of that is an excuse for writing a 3.5-pounder that comes in at like 1,200 pages. When it was published, one of my close friends at the law school, Alan Schwartz, came up to me. He was very excited. He said, "Tony, I see you just published a new book." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, I read the description online. It sounds fascinating. I just bought 2 copies, ordered 2 copies. I said, "Alan," I said, "I'm so flattered, 2 copies." I said, "But why 2? I mean, maybe one for New Haven and one for New York." He said, No. One to read and one for parking on steep hills. And afterwards, number of friends who made a stab at the book said, you really need to do this, but in an abbreviated version and hopefully a more accessible one. You shouldn't start with Aristotle, for God's sake. How about beginning with yourself and your interest and the questions that you explore in the book? So I heard that often enough to be motivated to write a much shorter book called After Disbelief, which covers a lot of the same ground and begins with some autobiographical remarks that I was hoping would be maybe of more interest to my readers than any of the abstract points I made in the pages that followed. But I also felt that I owed it to myself to try to give some accounting as best I could of how it was that I had come to these questions and to my preoccupation with them. So I started with myself, or rather I started with my parents, from whom myself comes. I was born, as Ryan mentioned in his introduction, in Los Angeles in 1945. And it's true that my father was a screenwriter, had a very successful career as a screenwriter. He wrote many of the scripts that Robert Post's father directed. So we joked at one point that this was a condition for appointment to the deanship at the Yale Law School, that you had to have had some association with Gunsmoke, either written the scripts or directed the shows or something. But before he was a Hollywood screenwriter, he was a rabbi. He was sent at the age of 16 by his parents from New York, where he was born and had grown up, to the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And he spent 6 or 7 years there in the rabbinical program, went to the University of Cincinnati at the same time. I don't know whether he told his parents he was doing this, maybe just to hedge his bets, make sure he had a secular degree in his pocket or something. But he finished the program and then went on for 2 or 3 years to lead a congregation in Washington, D.C. And the only thing he ever told me about it was that he loathed it. And he never explained why. I said, but Dad, why? It sounds kind of interesting. He says, no, I didn't like it. He said, I'd walk in the room and everybody would stop talking. I don't think that's your experience, Shmuley. But he said, I felt like the rabbinical wet blanket. And, you know, and I didn't really like it. And moreover, I never believed in God. So it seemed like a bad fit all around. He went back to New York and hung out with some bohemian misfits for several years, and worked for his brother Sam, who had a furniture-making business that specialized in church pews. Apparently, they had a booming business, and he made enough to hold body and soul together.
The Jewish business.
Very, very. It was a niche, and had an affair with Lillian Hellman, the playwright, and I knew that because my mother told me that she burned all of her letters to him. She claimed in an accident, and I said as an act of, historical erasure or something. I thought it was just terrible. But anyway, wasn't really happy there, and through a series of strange and improbable events that I won't recount, found his way to Los Angeles in the mid-30s and started working on a radio program as a writer, and eventually made the transition to television, where he had, as I said, a very successful career. And along the way, in 1942, met and married my mother, who was working as an actress at Warner Brothers at the time, starring in B. B is actually maybe dignifies them more than they deserve. B minus, C plus films, co-starring often with Ronald Reagan, who was constantly rescuing her from Mexican bandits and making sure the train didn't run over her and this and that. And they fell in love and married, and I was born 3 years later. My parents came from remarkably different backgrounds. My father had been raised in an Orthodox Jewish home on the Lower East Side. My mother in an evangelical Baptist household, presided over by her religious nutcase of a mother who would drag her around to tent revivals and in her later years converted to Catholicism and then deconverted and went through every, I shouldn't perhaps put it quite so pejoratively, but she was religiously unstable, enthusiastic but unstable. My mother grew up as a result of these early experiences with a profound mistrust of religion. She thought it was spooky and full of bad ideas that did harm to people, of small prejudices that she was very intelligent, that early on she could see were just bad for the soul and bad for the world. So she not only grew out of her religious heritage, such as it was, but grew to hate it, and to hate religion itself, in all of its organized forms, at least. My father, by the time he had left the rabbinate and moved to Los Angeles and started writing screenplays, had left Judaism way behind. And I wouldn't say that he had a hostility to religion, but he was decidedly indifferent to it, had no feeling for it, and tended, like my mom, to assign it to the realm of ghosts and superstition. His view of religion was cooler than my mother's, but because hers was the hot tempered, passionate view, it dominated in the house. And my father went along and deferred to my mom. And her fundamental principle, so when it came to religion, so far as child rearing was concerned, was my children will not only have no real, I will see to it they develop no taste for it, I'm going to do everything I can actively think to do to discourage a distaste. And she worked at that very deliberately and conscientiously for many years on me, her experimental pupil. A time came when, I don't know, I'm 10, 11, I asked my parents, I have friends who are, maybe I must have been a little bit older, who are going to confirmation or to bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs, and where do I fit in? Do I get one of those? Can I be confirmed? Or, maybe a bat mitzvah. I don't know. Would that be okay? And my mom said, well, that's a reasonable question. I'll tell you what we'll do. I'm going to take you and your younger brother who got drafted into this experiment, take you each week to a different religious service, and we'll investigate them all, and at the end you can decide which you prefer and what you'd like to be. And to my 12-year-old self, that sounded like a reasonable proposal. So the first Sunday came, and she took me to a Catholic high mass and made me wear a wool suit. And it was the most awful experience of my life. I had not a clue what people were mumbling in a language that, I would say it was Greek to me, except it was Latin to me. And I itched like crazy, and the next week came around, and my mom said, well, what will it be this week? And I said, it'll be the beach. I'm going to the beach. And that was the end of the experiment. But I came out of this crucible of forced disenchantment, pretty interested in religion, despite my mother's strenuous efforts and my father's kind of passive participation. If something is that bad for you, oh my God, it's got to be a little interesting, right? How can it attract so many people and do them so much harm? So I started kind of peeking around the corner to see what I could see about religion. I began to think about it and to ask myself in a very inarticulate, unformed way, why it is that so many people seem drawn to it so deeply and so passionately. I can say this now, looking back over all these years, I know that I was, quite apart from the appeal of the danger of the thing itself, I was a religiously curious person. That's a very vague formulation, and I'm not sure I can give you a precise account of what I mean by it. I mean very generally someone who is repeatedly and forcefully struck with the amazing fact that they're alive and that their life only lasts for a while, and who wonder about the rest of reality, including all that was before they came on the scene and everything that's to follow, and wonder about how the little transient episode they call their own life fits into the larger picture of things, and who believes maybe or comes to believe that if they don't have that it's important, maybe even desperately important, to pursue that question because a lot and maybe even everything depends upon how you sort it out. Not everyone feels this way. Of course, this is a question that occurs to everyone, but the spiritually curious person, as I use the term, is someone for whom this question becomes a preoccupation. It's a question that they can't get out of their mind, that's with them constantly. So they're sitting sometimes around a dinner table like this, and the thought occurs to them, well, we're having dinner here, but what about eternity? How does this relate to that? A person who can't get that out of their mind is a religiously curious person. There are religiously curious people who are not born into, are not active practitioners of any faith tradition. And there are plenty of people who are born into such a tradition and who practice it daily, perhaps, but are not religiously curious, in the way I'm using this phrase. But I am such a person, and I can say this now, I would say, I don't know, not with pride, but with resignation to myself, to who I am. It's just me, and you get far enough on in life, and you're either comfortable saying that or not, and I feel pretty comfortable saying it. So that I put that card on the table. Anyway, so I went off to college, grew up out of this Southern Californian, weirdly religiously charged, but in the negative way, environment in which I'd been brought up, went off to college, and was passionately drawn from the start to philosophy, to the study of philosophy, because that's where I thought these questions that I had were most likely to be answered. Of course, what I discovered soon enough is that it's only where they're most likely to be asked. That was enough. Diano, that was enough. I'd found the place where people were interested in what I was interested in, so I started studying philosophy. And very quickly, right at the start of my study of philosophy, I encountered the two great minds from whom so much of Western thought derives by one route or another. Plato, who's been mentioned by my friend by Harrison to my right, and Aristotle by Ryan to the left. So there they are, the two great giant.
That made you Socrates sitting.
You said it. And of course, very early, I began to read both of them and read enough of each to get a sense of the fundamental difference that distinguishes them in the most basic way, which ramifies in countless directions. But the basic difference is this. They both believe in eternity. They both believe in what Aristotle calls the eternal and divine. They are both theologians. They both believe that what happens in time at this dinner party can ultimately only be understood, made sense of, assigned its proper value if you view it under the aspect, as theologians say, of eternity. But they had strikingly different conceptions of where that eternity is to be found. And if you know Raphael's great painting of the School of Athens, it's Plato says here, and Aristotle says here. For Plato, the eternal and divine is not of this world. This is all just a blurred, fleeting copy of something that never comes into being, never passes away, that cannot not be. But it's not of this world. It's elsewhere. It's beyond. It's otherworldly. Aristotle said, it's right here. There's all the eternity that you could ever wish or hope to find right here in the world. It is the everlasting order of the world itself. It's the shape of the world. It's not something beyond it. And they had a famous quarrel over this. And reading them, I was given my two templates, you might say. These were the two basic options on the menu that I was handed as a freshman beginning my study of philosophy. And the two different ways, you might say, of satisfying my religious curiosity, my longing to find, make connection with the eternal and divine. I was instinctively, natively, just affectively, emotionally drawn to Aristotle. And why? Well, that's like saying, why do you have the temperament you do? Why do you like the things you do? I could give a long answer as to why Aristotle's philosophy is the better of the two, but that's all an afterthought. My attraction to Aristotle began with something much more primitive than that. It began, I suspect, with my love of the world. I grew up out of doors, on boats in the water, and I just loved the world. I loved being in the world. And Plato's otherworldliness seemed kind of thin to me. Or I didn't like a philosophy which depreciated the here and now. What Socrates in the Republic calls the world of sights and sounds, the theater of spectacles. I didn't like a philosophy that depreciated that as radically as Plato's did, so I kind of went for Aristotle. And read more Aristotle and found myself drawn more and more deeply into his orbit. And then I met a philosopher on the faculty at Williams named Dan O'Connor, a devout Catholic, wrestling with his Catholicism, who was preoccupied with one question above all, and that was, how should we understand the encounter of Abrahamism in its Western European form, that is to say, the Christian tradition? How should we understand the encounter between the Christian tradition and the pagan philosophy of Aristotle? The Christian religion, this is true of Islam and Judaism too, of course, at least in the mainstream Orthodox versions of each of these three religions, separates the world on the one hand, time, and God and eternity on the other, in the same way that Plato does. There is a striking affinity, which the great thinkers in all three of these traditions recognized, between their transcendent conception of divinity and the Platonic view, which led Nietzsche, many centuries later, brilliant reader and connoisseur of thinkers, to describe Christianity as Platonism for the people. It's a magnificent formula that has a great deal packed into it. But Dan O'Connor's class got me thinking, well, so there was the ancient world and Plato and Aristotle, and then there was this long Christian interlude in the West, which lasted for a millennium or more, and that was really Platonism on steroids. So where's Aristotle in this? He just seems to have been cast aside or fallen by the wayside. I know, of course, Ryan, that there were attempts, strenuous, brilliant, profoundly thoughtful attempts to reintroduce Aristotle's wisdom philosophy into the creationist theologies of each of the three Abrahamic religions. The Muslims tried it first. Maimonides gave it a serious run, and of course Thomas Aquinas and others did too. But I thought those were all failures because the attempted the shidduch that they were trying to make between Aristotle and the God who calls from beyond, it just was never ever going to work, because Aristotle's philosophy is predicated on the divinity of the world itself, and no, believing Jew or Christian or Muslim can accept that. So I felt, again, that Aristotle had somehow been kind of thrown under in the West, the Christian bus. But I didn't want to let him go, and I kept reading around and looking for a lifeline somewhere that would help me hold on to my Aristotelianism, but under conditions that seemed to me more amenable to my own very modern beliefs and commitments, the most important of which was a belief in the dignity, the value, the supreme value even of the individual, the dignity of the individual. This is a concept which is metaphysically foreign to Aristotle's philosophy and to Plato's as well. Individuals don't count because individuality isn't really something real. All that's real is the general shape of things. The individuality of a thing, of a person, of a glass, of a picture on the wall, the individuality of it, it doesn't even exist, really. And if you think it does, that's an illusion. You're not thinking straight. Well, I thought that was wrong. And the Abrahamic religions supported me in that conviction because each of them teaches the supreme beauty and dignity of the individual. So I wanted to hold on to that, may I call it, Abrahamic insight, it seemed to me profound, and revive or preserve, resuscitate my Aristotelian conviction that the world itself is God. And God is not some being apart from the world, separate from it, who brings the world into being, but just the world itself under a certain description. And then I found the thinker who did it all for me, and this is the answer to your question, Ryan. It was Spinoza, who you could describe as a latter-day Aristotelian slash lapsed Jew slash probably a lot of other things, who restored divinity to the world after this long Christian interlude during which God had been exiled from the world. Spinoza brought God back home, reinstalled God in his earthly throne, and at the same time built a metaphysical system which assigned absolute value to the individual. In Spinoza's radical vision of things, not just the human individual, but every individual thing. And there I had it. And the religious curiosity, which I had felt really from my earliest days, as far back as I can look in my life, that itch was satisfied. It's not that I've never had to scratch again, but I felt that I was coming on to a path of understanding which intellectually and spiritually did for me the things that I felt it most urgent to do or to be done. And that was a tremendous release, a liberation. It was an enlightenment moment for me. Spinoza teaches, among other things, that our efforts, our struggle to become more perfect human beings, that's never done because the goal is beyond our finite grasp. Aristotle didn't believe that. He thought that if you worked at it, studied long enough, had the good luck to have the right teacher, you could become as perfect as a human being can be, which isn't as perfect as a star on Aristotle's view, but it's as perfect as a human being can be. Spinoza thought otherwise. He thought you can work at becoming more perfect, and you can make progress and reach a higher station, but that's just a way station to a higher station. It's a resting plateau for further efforts at greater self-perfection. And joy, Spinoza says, exists in the movement from a lower level of power. That's his word to describe your capacity to understand and to do things with your understanding. Joy exists in the movement from a lower order of power to a higher order. And of course, the minute you're at the higher order, the joy is over. It exists only in transit. And then the challenge is to try to kick it up a notch, as Emeril says, and do it all over again. But there's no end to that. So the work is never done. So my Spinozism doesn't leave me content and sitting on my rear end thinking, well, now I've hit the human bliss point and I'm as perfect as a human being can be. That's complete and total nonsense for me personally, and for any follower of Spinoza. So that's kind of been the arc of a voyage, and it brings me around to a question that will lead me in a couple of minutes to what I said at the very beginning of my talk. Spinoza was a very bad Jew. He was the poster child for bad Jew, at least in the eyes of some. For others, he was a Jewish hero, not just a hero of thought, but a Jewish hero. Why a bad Jew? Well, I'm sure you all know he was formally excommunicated by his congregation in Amsterdam in 1650 something, I think it was, because it was reported he was going around teaching his teenage friends that after you die, there's no life after you die, and the world is God. And they ran and tattled on Spinoza to the rabbi, and the rabbi called him in, and they had a chat. And Spinoza says, well, that's honestly kind of what I believe. And he said, you're out. And they expelled him. And you can read it today, the formal, what is it called?
Harem.
The harem. The declaration of apostasy or something.
In the glass case in Amsterdam.
In Amsterdam, yes. So this was a big event, and it was a formal proceeding. And Spinoza basically said, whatever, and he went his way. And he spent the rest of his relatively short life in the company of his Christian friends who were happy to take him in. Most of them, nearly all of them, not practicing Christians, but Christian by birth and by affiliation. They welcomed Baruch, who changed his name to Benedict, to signal the shift of allegiances. But the Jews thought he had turned his back on the Jewish people. He was no friend to the Jewish people. And that's true in an important respect. In his book called The Theological Political Treatise, it's not Moses but Jesus that Spinoza holds up as the emblem of spiritual rationality. Interestingly, Hobbes does just the reverse, but that's another story. But you read that book and you look at Spinoza's life and you say, traitor, turncoat, not a friend to the Jewish people. So I am a friend to the Jewish people. I'm a Spinozist, which is about as thoroughly rationalistic as you can get, and I am a friend to the Jewish people because I am a Jew, and I say that with self-understanding and with conviction and pride. Spinoza would never have said that, I don't believe, after he had left his congregation. And that has left me with a question to wrestle with. I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I don't know that I have a good answer to it, which is, okay, so you're a Spinozist. That kind of closes your spiritual arc. How can you count yourself a Jew, too? I mean, Jews have very particular local allegiances. They're not the rationalist cosmopolitans that Spinozists aspire to be. And I don't know that I can say much that is clarifying about that. Other than that, I feel at home with my people. And I feel that the things I value are valued by my people and have been valued by them over a very, very long time. So what is Jewish life for me? Is it going to temple? Is it praying? Is it observing the dietary rules? Well, it can't be any of those things because I do none of them. Mm-hmm. It's this. And this, I'm using the term very loosely now, you'll forgive me, this has been going on for a very, very long time. And it's rare, it's valuable, and I am responsible for doing what I can to keep it alive and to pass it on. I mean, first of all, how could I possibly take it upon myself to cut the chain and say, well, that's enough of that, and now we're going to try something new? But beyond that, it's valuable. It's so important to me. And if it's so important to me and so important to the people with whom I identify so closely, how can I not feel an allegiance to them? It's an allegiance to myself in a very deep way. And I have never felt that more strongly than I have the last 5 days.
And then an apology, as I mentioned to Professor Kronman, that I have an engagement party for a nephew in New York tonight, which I'm about 2 hours late for, and I'm going to depart. But I want to depart on a high note, if I can. Just responding to your brilliant, as always, talk. Professor Kronman, about 8 or 9 years ago, led a discussion in a big auditorium at Yale with perhaps one of the greatest Jewish rabbis, philosophers, ethicists, historians, by the name of Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. And it was an auditorium packed with a few hundred students on the 7 questions of the universe. One of the great historical days in the history of Yale, frankly. Charlie Hill of blessed memory emailed me the next morning and said, Shmuley, a Zen moment at Yale. It was fantastic, brilliant. We recorded it, thank God, and we have photographs. Subsequent to that dinner, to that lecture, we sat down for dinner in another location of Shabtai, which was then in transition in an apartment on Chapel Street. And the table was a little bit smaller than this. Number of faculty and a number of students. There's a photograph on the wall, which I pointed out to Professor Kronman before, of Professor Stephen Smith with Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz on the wall in the hallway. Matisse Piton, who graduated last year, now at Harvard, once asked me who is in the photograph with Professor Smith, which was interesting. And I said, that's Adin Steinsaltz. I never heard of him. I said, well, you should. He's one of the great Jewish writers, authors, philosophers, and rabbis of the 20th century, a real genius. He came back a few days later and said to me, I asked Professor Smith, what happened? The photograph's a pretty compelling photograph. What happened? And Stephen Smith had just finished his book, Modernity and Its Discontents. And he says, well, I couldn't have written the book without having met him. But there's something else that happened that night in light of your talk, which I want to mention. Stephen Smith wrote a book called Liberalism, Spinoza, and the Question of Jewish Identity, or Liberalism, Spinoza, and Jewish Identity. I always question if the word question is not title. I got to go back and check. I read the book 20 years ago. So, Professor Kronman, Stephen Smith was taking shots. Rabbi Steinsaltz was smoking his pipe and taking shots. They were in the apartment that night after your talk. And Stephen Smith had written this book about Spinoza and turned to this great sage. If there was a sage living in the 20th century, Rav Steinsaltz would have been one of those great sages. And he said to Rav Steinsaltz, after probably his 5th or 6th whiskey, which is generally when even the great philosophers start speaking truths. and he said, maybe I shouldn't be teaching Spinoza after all. And Rav Steinsaltz, the great genius, turned to him and said, maybe you can redeem Spinoza.
Maybe you can
redeem Spinoza. And that's the photograph. So. going to open it up to Q&A.
Yeah.